Hi, welcome to our Mythbusters project. Today we will be talking about a myth in psychology and proving whether it is true or not. Our myth is, if ordered by a person in a position of authority, most people would torture another person.
So, some relevant terms regarding the main topic are the following: obedience, which is a form of social influence in which a person yields to explicit instructions or order from an authority figure. An example that can explain this word is from the Milgram study. The powerful ability of those in authority to control others was demonstrated in a remarkable set of studies performed by Stanley Milgram. Another term used is social power, the ability of a person to create conformity even when the people being influenced may attempt to resist those changes. Another term is conformity, compliance with standards, rules, or laws, and behavior in accordance with socially accepted conventions or standards. Another example that can explain this term is from the Stanford prison experiment, where prisoners had to comply with the guards' rules and regulations. Then we have de-individuation. This is where people's tendency to lose their awareness and restraint when in groups. Then we have torture, forcing someone to do something they don't want to do, or the action of inflicting severe pain on someone as a punishment. Last but not least, authority, someone who has the power to give orders and enforce obedience. Evidence of where the myth exists and why people believe it. This myth exists among the many studies and experiments conducted, such as the Stanford prison experiment, Milgram studies, and more. People believe this myth because of those experiments conducted. They give proof that people with a higher authority can give permission or influence others to torture another person. Some movies that relate to the myth are the Stanford prison experiment, which is on Netflix, The Report on Amazon, and then some articles that relate to the myth as well. One article, The Guardian, it's, as the title says, does torture work and is it worth the cost? One other article is Human Rights Watch, and the title for that is The Legal Prohibition Against Torture.
One of the experiments we are focusing on is the Milgram experiment. But before we get into it, a little history behind it was that it was a study conducted to find out about how ordinary people, such as the Germans in World War II, could commit atrocities. In the Nuremberg trials, which were trials after World War II, it brought Nazis to justice, but many of the people's defenses against the charges placed on them were that they had to take orders from higher authority. Stanley Milgram, who was a psychologist at Yale University, wondered how ordinary people could commit these terrible atrocities and how far people would go in obeying orders or instructions when it involved hurting another person. To test this theory, Milgram conducted a study that focused on the conflict between obedience to authority and a personal conscience. His test subjects were 40 males from the age range of 20 to 50, and they were from an area called New Haven. He set up the experiments where the participants were the teachers, and he had actors play the learners to set a scenario where the teachers would shock the students when the word taught to them was repeated incorrectly. The authority figure who told them to apply the electric shocks when the word was said incorrectly was a scientist who wore a white coat. When the word was said incorrectly, the actor would cry out in order to show the subject that they felt the pain of the shock, but in reality, the actors were not harmed. It tested how far participants would go in administering the voltage when asked by an authority figure. In the beginning of the experiment, the protocols were reviewed, and the vast majority of people concluded that they would not go anywhere near the highest levels of shock. Surprisingly, the results showed that 2/3 of participants would take the shock to the maximum level, contrary to the statement they gave in the beginning of the experiment. If the participants had any worries about the shock, the experimenter used verbal statements such as, "The experiment requires that you continue," and such, to convince them to go on with the experiment. The lesson learned from the experiment was that if an authority gives signal and permission or orders to subjects, they are willing to administer extreme measures of pain for minor reasons, and they lacked empathy and showed signs of extreme psychopathy with the decisions that they made when instructed to do so verbally. The results concluded if instructed to do so, an ordinary person would follow the instructions to the extent of killing someone, because obedience was actually very deeply ingrained in our very society. The after effects of the experiment during the experiment, a lot of the people who were asked to administer high voltages of electricity were in extreme distress, and in some cases some even had seizures.
The Stanford Prison Experiment. The goal of the Stanford Prison Experiment was to understand the development of norms and the effects of roles, labels, and social expectations in a simulated prison environment. The experiment was conducted by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. The research team recruited participants by placing newspaper advertisements in the Palo Alto Times and the Stanford Daily, offering $15 a day to male college students for a study on the psychology of imprisonment. The study was funded by a government grant from the U.S. Office of Naval Research to study antisocial behavior. More than 75 people responded to the ad, but only 24 were chosen, 12 to play the role of prisoners and to play the role of guards. These students had no prior record of criminal arrests, medical conditions, or psychological disorders. To start off, the Palo Alto police conducted surprise arrests at the home of the prisoners. Students were handcuffed, searched, read their rights, and driven in a squad car to the police station for booking and fingerprinting. The experiment went on from August 14th to August 20th of 1971. The experiment was set to last 2 weeks, but the guards became so abusive that the experiment had to be shut down after only 6 days rather than the 2 weeks planned. They became abusive and began using wooden batons as symbols of status. They wore mirrored sunglasses and the uniform of a prison guard, while the prisoners wore prison clothing, were called by numbers instead of names, and wore ankle chains. The guards became sadistic in about 1/3 of the cases. They harassed the prisoners, imposed large amounts of exercise as punishments, refused to allow them access to toilets, and would remove their mattresses. These prisoners were just students and not guilty of any criminal offense. This scenario was what Zimbardo referred to as de-individuation, in which people might define themselves with respect to their roles, not to themselves or their ethical standards as persons. When playing a role, even when we know it's not real, we eventually tend to adopt the attitudes and actions that go with the role, and become the role, and you forget who you really are. The day before the Stanford Prison Experiment began, the researchers held an orientation session for the participants in which they communicated expectations for hostile guard behavior and a prisoner mindset. Across 3 studies, participants exposed to the Stanford orientation rather than a control orientation reported greater expectations for hostile and oppressive behavior as guards, even though they did not directly tell the participants to inflict any violence. The results provide support for speculation that the language of the guard orientation in the Stanford Prison Experiment allowed or suggested abuse among guards. The guards eventually conformed to using violence. Some reasons that we are more likely to conform to something is when we're in a group with at least 3 people, or know that others in the group will observe our behavior. This experiment was recorded and monitored by researchers, and there were plenty more than 3 people involved in the experiment. I think another factor that would have encouraged the guards to conform to violence was the fact that they were getting paid to do their role. They might have thought that if they didn't play their role as they thought they were expected to, then they wouldn't have gotten paid, or they would have been terminated from the experiment. The way that they treated the prisoners could have been influenced by movies or shows or other violence seen in the media. Many people who have engaged in torturing others show great distress over what they've done. Humans are naturally empathetic and capable of simulating the internal states that another human experiences. Imposing pain or stress on another human comes with a psychological cost to ourselves, and although individuals might have their own moral compass, they are capable of overriding it and inflicting severe punishments on others when an authority figure is present and institutional circumstances demand it.
Communities that it affected and the events the myth applies to is two of the many historical events. The first is Hitler and the Holocaust, and describing how Hitler was against all Jews. He initiated World War II, which resulted in about 50 million deaths. He then became part of the Nazi Party. Hitler then created a dictatorship, having Parliament pass a law combining both presidency and chancellorship, and from there Hitler took over the new position and increased his power. He aimed to murder every Jew regardless of age and gender. Many of these Jews were tortured awfully. There were many torture devices such as gas chambers, the iron boot, and hanging. Because he was so powerful, everyone felt the need to listen to him, also because they were very scared. The second event is the Japanese concentration camps, headed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1942, he signed an executive order that allowed the military to force people of Japanese ancestry into internment camps. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan and entered World War II. That is when Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order. Roughly 112,000 people were detained in camps. The camps were made because people became paranoid that Japanese Americans would help Japan against the United States after the Pearl Harbor attack, aka sabotage. So President Roosevelt was under a lot of pressure, not only from military leaders, but also the wider public, to isolate the Japanese community. Within these camps were awful living conditions. They were very limited to what they could do, such as poor housing, lack of care, food, medical help, and schooling. Because of this, they were seen more as prison inmates than individuals. To give a broader aspect, another example of this is slavery. Slaves were treated differently depending on their masters. They were forced to work long hours with little rest. Slaves had no rights and were under the orders of their masters 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They could be bought or sold at any time. Most people who oversaw, like masters or overseers, sometimes abused slaves just to assert their dominance. Slavery is when an individual owns another. They have complete control over their lives. Often the punishment was used to make slaves work faster, in a turn making production faster. Some torture devices were whipping, beating, branding, and shackling. As you can see, people misuse authority to torture people because they feel as if they hold more power and make others feel less.
So, is this myth true or false? With the information we've gathered thus far, we can respectfully say that this myth is true. Though it is cruel and prohibited to torture another person, it has and still occurs all around the world. As a group, we've defined torture in many ways besides physical pain. Torture can cause emotional pain as well, because of certain words being used that can indicate harm or harassment.